Winter had swallowed the Montana Valley whole. In a cabin buried under drifts taller than a grown man, Cammie Gaddis knelt on the cold floor, counting flour. Her fingertips traced the wooden bowl's rim. 3 cups remained, maybe 4 if she scraped the cracks. Behind her, 2 small bodies huddled beneath a patchwork quilt so thin she could see their breath rising through it like ghosts. Outside, the wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human. Her younger sister coughed, a wet, rattling sound that had grown worse each day since the blizzard killed their last cow. Cammie's hands did not shake as she divided the flour into smaller portions. She had learned not to let them see her fear. At 21, she should have been planning a wedding to some local ranch hand, dancing at harvest festivals, dreaming of children who would grow up with full bellies. Instead, she darned socks by candlelight and told her siblings stories to distract them from hunger. The livestock was gone. The garden lay frozen beneath 6 feet of snow, and their father had not returned from his trip to town 3 weeks ago. That afternoon, she sat at the rough-hewn table, stitching patches onto a coat that had already been mended twice. Her brother, barely 10, asked when Papa would come home. Her sister, 8 years old with eyes too large for her thin face, wanted to know if there would be supper. Cammie told them yes to both questions, though she was certain of neither. When darkness fell, she stood at the frosted window, watching grey snow fall against a greyer sky. Somewhere beyond these mountains, life continued. Trains carried passengers to cities with gas lamps and warm hotels. Women wore silk dresses and never worried about the price of salt. But here, in this forgotten valley, survival was measured in cups of flour and split firewood. A shadow moved across the window. Cammie's breath caught. The shape was too large to be an animal, too deliberate to be her imagination. She reached for the rifle above the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she heard it, the steady scrape of steel on stone. Someone was sharpening a blade on her porch. She gripped the rifle and pulled back the bolt as quietly as she could. Her siblings stirred beneath their blanket. Through the ice-crusted glass, she saw him. A man stood in the dying light, broad as a bear, wrapped in furs and canvas that made him look like something carved from the mountain itself. His beard was thick with frost. His hair, pulled back from a weathered face, caught the last rays of sun like dark copper wire. At his feet lay a deer carcass, fresh enough that steam still rose from its body. He did not knock. He simply waited, as if he knew she was watching, as if he had all the time in the world while her family starved. Cammie opened the door a crack. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to steal her breath. The man's eyes met hers. They were grey, the color of winter sky before a storm, and they did not waver. He said nothing at first. Instead, he nudged the deer carcass forward with his boot. "Linton Cantrell," he finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "You know me." She did. Everyone in the valley knew of the lone wolf hunter who traded pelts at the general store and disappeared into the mountains for months at a time. He never smiled, never spoke beyond what was necessary. Mothers warned their daughters to avoid him. Men gave him wide berth, unsure whether to respect his solitude or fear it. "What do you want?" Cammie's voice came steadier than she felt. Linton shifted his weight, and she noticed how the leather of his gloves had been worn smooth by years of holding reins and skinning knives. "Your father's dead," he said, blunt as a hammer blow. "Froze in town before he could get help." The words hit her like physical things. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she kept her grip on the rifle, kept her face hard. "I'm sorry," he continued, though his expression remained carved from stone. "But you need to hear the rest. You got maybe 2 weeks of cold left this hard, then another month before the pass clears. You won't make it." Cammie's jaw tightened. "We'll manage." "No." The single word held no cruelty, only certainty. "You won't." He took a step closer, and she raised the rifle an inch. He stopped, raising one gloved hand slowly. "I got a proposition. You come with me tonight. Marry me by the territorial minister when the thaw comes. Your brother and sister, I'll see them fed and housed in town till spring. After that, you bring them wherever we settle." "And why?" Cammie's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "Would I trade myself to a stranger?" "Because you're smart enough to know when you're beat." His grey eyes held hers without flinching. "And because I need a wife who knows how to survive. Not some town girl who'll faint at the sight of blood." She wanted to spit at his feet, wanted to slam the door and prove him wrong. But behind her, her sister coughed again, and the sound cut through Cammie's pride like a skinning knife through hide. "What kind of life are you offering?" she asked. "An honest one." Linton glanced at the mountains rising behind him, their peaks lost in cloud. "I got a place. Remote. You'll work, but you'll never be cold or hungry again. Neither will they." He nodded toward the cabin. Cammie studied him. The fur collar of his coat was thick with frost. The canvas beneath showed signs of careful mending. His boots were worn but well-oiled. Everything about him spoke of someone who understood the mountains, who knew how to wring life from a landscape that killed the careless. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, held something else. Not cruelty, but a deep, unreadable distance, as if he stood perpetually on the far side of a frozen river she could not cross. "How do I know you won't hurt us?" For the first time, something almost like pain flickered across his face. "You don't. But I give you my word, for what that's worth. Your family stays safe. You stay safe. All I ask is you leave tonight, and don't look back." The wind picked up, driving snow between them. Cammie's sister called her name weakly from inside. She thought of the 3 cups of flour, the weeks until spring, her father's body frozen somewhere in town, beyond her ability to bury or mourn. "I need an hour," she said. Linton gave a single nod. "I'll ready the wagon." She closed the door and leaned against it, the rifle trembling now in her hands. Her brother and sister stared at her with questions they were too afraid to ask. Cammie crossed to the table and pulled out a tin box where she kept her mother's wedding ring and a handful of letters. "Listen to me," she said, kneeling before them. "A man is going to take you to the minister's wife in town. You'll stay there, warm and fed, until spring. Then you'll come to me." "Where are you going?" her brother asked, his voice breaking. Cammie cupped his face in her work-roughened hands. "Somewhere safe, but I need you to be brave a little while longer. Can you do that?" They nodded, though tears streaked both their faces. She packed their few belongings into a canvas sack, then pulled out her mother's brown shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. She added her own wool-lined winter dress, the one she had saved for her wedding day, though she had never imagined it would come to this. When she stepped outside, Linton had brought the wagon close. It was a sturdy thing, built for mountain roads, with high sides and a canvas cover lashed tight against the weather. 2 massive draft horses stood patient in their traces, their breath clouding the air. He helped her siblings up first, tucking blankets around them with surprising gentleness. Then he turned to Cammie and offered his gloved hand. She ignored it and climbed up herself, clutching her leather satchel to her chest. Inside were the letters, the ring, and one small book she had borrowed from the circuit preacher. It was all she had left of the person she used to be. Linton swung up beside her, taking the reins with hands that moved like they had done this 10,000 times. He did not look at her as he urged the horses forward, but she felt his presence like a wall of heat against the cold. They rode in silence through the valley, past abandoned cabins and frozen fields. Cammie kept her eyes forward, refusing to watch her home disappear behind them. When they finally stopped at the minister's house in town, she climbed down and held her siblings one last time. "I love you," she whispered into their hair. "I will come for you." Then Linton was beside her again, helping her back onto the wagon. Her siblings' cries followed them down the road until distance and snow swallowed the sound. For an hour, they traveled through darkness. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the thud of hooves, and the endless wind. Cammie sat rigid, her back straight, determined not to show weakness before this silent stranger she had promised herself to. Finally, she spoke. "Where exactly is this place of yours?" Linton's eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead, barely visible in the moonlight. Higher up, past where most folks go. That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting tonight. Anger flared in her chest, hot and sudden. I just gave up everything for a man who won't even tell me where he's taking me. He turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight, his face was all hard plains and shadow. You gave up nothing. You traded a slow death for a chance. That's called survival, Miss Gaddis. And up here, it's the only currency that matters. She wanted to argue, but the truth in his words stole her breath. They rode on. Near midnight, they reached a frozen river. Linton stopped the wagon and climbed down, checking the ice with careful strikes of his walking stick. The horses snorted nervously. Cammie peered over the edge of the wagon and saw black water moving beneath the white surface. We're crossing that? Her voice came thin with fear. Only way through. Linton returned to the wagon and met her eyes. Trust the horses. Trust me. Don't move sudden, and we'll be fine. He guided the team onto the ice. The surface groaned beneath them. Cammie's fingers dug into the wooden seat as cracks spiderwebbed outward from the wheels. Water seeped up through the fractures, dark and hungry. Halfway across, the ice gave a sound like thunder. The wagon lurched sideways. Cammie felt herself sliding, felt the world tilt as the left wheel broke through. Then Linton's arm was around her waist, iron strong, pulling her against him as he fought to control the panicked horses. His other hand worked the reins with brutal efficiency, shouting commands in a voice that cut through the animals' fear. The wagon shuddered, groaned, then surged forward as the horses found purchase on solid ice. They made the far bank in a spray of frozen water and snow. Cammie was shaking, her heart wild in her chest. Linton's arm remained around her, steady and warm. She became suddenly aware of how close they were, how she could feel the rise and fall of his breath, smell the pine and leather and smoke that clung to his clothes. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He released her slowly, as if she were something fragile he might break. They continued climbing. The road narrowed to a track, then to little more than a suggestion between the trees. Snow fell heavier now, turning the world into a white void, where only the sound of the horses' breathing kept them tethered to reality. Just when Cammie thought she would lose all sense of direction, all hope of ever finding her way back, Linton pulled the horses to a stop. "Close your eyes," he said. "What?" "Close them. Trust me this once." Against every instinct, Cammie closed her eyes. She felt the wagon move forward, heard the echo of wheels against stone, sensed walls rising around them. The air changed, growing warmer, smelling of minerals and earth. "Now look," Linton said, his voice carrying something new, something almost like pride. Cammie opened her eyes. They had passed through a narrow canyon into a hidden valley, and there, rising from the mist like something from a fever dream, stood a mansion. Not a cabin, not a hunting lodge, a true mansion, built from golden stone that caught the moonlight and threw it back like captured sun. 3 stories high, with turrets and balconies and windows that glowed with real gaslight. Gardens stretched around it, kept green by steam rising from underground springs. Orchards lined the walls. And everywhere, was the gleam of gold. Cammie's hands went numb. The leather satchel fell from her lap into the wagon bed. "What?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Linton watched her face with those unreadable grey eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cantrell," he said quietly. "Welcome to the Golden Castle. If this story already has you wondering what secrets lie behind those golden walls, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice to save the people you love? And what would you like to see more of in our future videos? Your thoughts help us craft better stories for you. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks through snow that had fallen without pause for 3 days. Cammie sat rigid beside Linton, the leather satchel clutched against her chest like armor. Behind them, the minister's house had long since disappeared into the white void, taking with it her brother's tear-streaked face and her sister's small hand pressed against the frosted window. She told herself not to look back, told herself that survival meant moving forward, always forward, even when every instinct screamed to turn around. But the cold had a way of making thoughts circle like wolves, and she kept seeing her sister's cough, hearing her brother's voice crack when he asked if she would really come back for them. "They'll be fine," Linton said, the first words he had spoken in an hour. Cammie's jaw tightened. "You don't know that. Minister's wife raised 6 of her own. She knows how to keep children fed and warm." He kept his eyes on the barely visible path ahead. More than you could do in that cabin. The truth of it stung worse than the wind. Cammie turned her face away, blinking against tears that would freeze on her cheeks if she let them fall. She had scraped and stretched and rationed every scrap for months, and still it hadn't been enough. Still, her father had died trying to find help she couldn't provide. The horses plodded on, their massive bodies cutting through drifts that would have stopped lesser animals. Linton drove them with a steady confidence that spoke of countless journeys through worse conditions. His gloved hands never wavered on the reins. His eyes never stopped scanning the landscape, reading signs in the snow that Cammie couldn't begin to interpret. "How far?" she finally asked. "Far enough that turning back stops being an option about 2 hours ago." She absorbed this in silence. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a frozen cathedral, beautiful and merciless. Pine trees stood sentinel, their branches heavy with snow. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and the sound carried across the valley like a thread of pure loneliness. "You ever been married before?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Linton's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "No. So why now? Why me?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something carefully considered. "Because you didn't flinch when I told you about your father. Because you counted that flower like a general counting ammunition. Because when you opened that door, you had a rifle and the will to use it." He glanced at her briefly. "Most women I know would have folded by now. Most women you know probably haven't had to choose between starvation and marrying a stranger." True enough. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "But you didn't just choose survival. You chose to save them first. That takes a particular kind of strength." Cammie didn't know what to say to that. She pulled her mother's shawl tighter and watched the snow fall. The temperature was dropping as night deepened. Even wrapped in wool and canvas, the cold found ways to seep through, settling into her bones like an ache that would never fully leave. They traveled through darkness that felt absolute. No moon broke through the clouds. No stars offered guidance. Only Linton seemed to know where they were going, following some internal compass that required no light. Near midnight, the trees opened onto a wide expanse of white. Cammie heard it before she saw it, the sound of water moving beneath ice, a deep grinding whisper that made her stomach clench. "The crossing," Linton said, bringing the horses to a halt. In the dim light, she could make out the frozen river stretching before them, perhaps 100 yards of uncertain surface between them and the far bank. Cracks spiderwebbed across it like dark veins. Here and there, patches of black water showed where the ice had worn thin. Linton climbed down from the wagon and moved to inspect the crossing. He walked carefully, testing the ice with a heavy walking stick, listening to the sounds it made under pressure. The horses shifted nervously, their ears flat against their skulls. Cammie's mouth went dry. "Is there another way?" 3 days north." He returned to the wagon, his face grim. "We don't have 3 days. This is the route. That ice won't hold us. It will if we're smart about it." He climbed back up beside her and gathered the reins. "I need you to listen carefully. When we're on the ice, you don't move. You don't shift your weight. You don't grab for anything. If the wagon tips, you jump clear and swim for the far bank. The current will try to pull you under. Fight it. Understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Linton guided the horses onto the ice. The surface groaned immediately under their weight. Cammie felt the wagon settle, felt the ice flex beneath them like something alive and angry. Water seeped up through hairline cracks, dark and viscous in the cold. The horses moved with terrible slowness, each step deliberate and careful. Linton's hands were steady on the reins, his voice low and constant, speaking to the animals in tones too soft for Cammie to make out. The ice complained with every yard they crossed, popping and cracking in a language of imminent failure. They were halfway across when Cammie heard it, a sound like distant thunder rolling up from beneath them. She looked down and saw the crack racing toward them, a jagged black line splitting the white surface. "Hold on," Linton said, his voice sharp. The left rear wheel broke through. The wagon lurched sideways with a violence that threw Cammie against Linton. Water exploded upward, black and shocking. The horses screamed, their hooves scrabbling for purchase on ice that was disintegrating around them. Cammie felt herself sliding toward the gaping hole, felt the pull of current beneath the ice, hungry and patient. Then Linton's arm locked around her waist, iron strong, hauling her back against him. His other hand worked the reins with brutal efficiency, muscles corded beneath his coat as he fought to control 2,000 pounds of panicked horse. "Get up!" he roared at the team. "Get up! Damn you!" The horses lunged forward. The wagon groaned, tilted, seemed to hang suspended between staying afloat and plunging through. Cammie couldn't breathe. She was pressed so tightly against Linton she could feel his heart hammering against her spine, could feel every shift of muscle as he threw his entire body into keeping them alive. The ice shrieked, the wagon shuddered, and then, impossibly, they were moving again. The horses found solid ice and threw themselves forward with everything they had. The wagon lurched after them, one wheel trailing water and chunks of broken ice. They hit the far bank in a spray of snow and frozen mud. The horses didn't stop until they were 20 yards clear, their sides heaving, steam rising from their bodies in great clouds. Linton's arm remained locked around Cammie for several heartbeats after they stopped. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Her dress was soaked from the spray, already freezing stiff in the brutal cold. "You all right?" His voice was rough, strained. She nodded against his shoulder, not trusting herself to speak. He released her slowly and immediately stripped off his heavy, fur-collared coat, draping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, made her gasp. "You'll freeze," she managed. "I'll manage." He was already moving, checking the horses, examining the wagon's damaged wheel. Beneath the fur coat he wore only canvas and wool, but he moved as if the cold was a minor inconvenience rather than a killing force. Cammie watched him work, watched the practiced efficiency of his movements, the way he spoke softly to the trembling horses while his hands checked their legs for injury. This was a man who had survived things that would kill softer people. Whatever else he was, whatever secrets he kept, he knew how to stay alive in a world that wanted him dead. They continued climbing after he jury-rigged a temporary fix for the wheel. The road narrowed to barely more than a track, winding between trees so thick they blocked what little starlight filtered through the clouds. Cammie dozed despite the cold, exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. She woke to stillness. The wagon had stopped. Linton sat beside her, his gaze fixed on something ahead that she couldn't yet see. The quality of darkness had changed. They were surrounded by walls of stone, she realized, close enough to touch on either side. "Where are we?" Her voice came out hoarse. "The pass." He turned to look at her, and in the darkness his eyes were unreadable. "Close your eyes." "What?" "Trust me. Close your eyes." Every instinct rebelled against it. But something in his voice, not command, but request, made her obey. She closed her eyes and felt the wagon begin to move again. The echo of wheels changed, becoming hollow, confined. They were in a tunnel, she realized, or a canyon so narrow it might as well be one. The air grew warmer. She could smell minerals, sulfur, something green and growing that had no business existing in winter. Steam hissed somewhere nearby. The ground beneath the wheels changed from snow to stone, to something that almost felt like packed earth. "Now," Linton said quietly. Cammie opened her eyes. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, They had emerged into a valley that defied everything she knew about winter. Steam rose from pools of crystalline water. Trees grew thick and green, fed by underground heat. And there, rising from the center of it all like something conjured from imagination, stood the golden castle. It was massive. 3 stories of golden stone that caught the pre-dawn light and threw it back transformed. Turrets rose at each corner. Balconies wrapped around the upper floors. Windows, dozens of them, glowed with gaslight. Real gaslight, not candles or oil lamps. Gardens stretched out in every direction, kept alive by the geothermal heat. Orchards lined stone walls, and everywhere, worked into the stone, into the gates, into the very bones of the structure, was gold. Not paint, not gilt. Real gold, veining through the stone like frozen rivers. Cammie's hands had gone numb. The leather satchel slipped from her lap and hit the wagon bed with a soft thud. Her mind struggled to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about the man sitting beside her. This is... She couldn't finish the sentence. Home, Linton said simply. He urged the horses forward, guiding them up a wide drive lined with trees whose leaves remained impossibly green. "You're not a hunter," Cammie said, the words coming out flat with shock. "I am. Among other things." He pulled the wagon to a stop before a massive entrance flanked by carved columns. But we'll get to that. The front doors opened before they had fully stopped. A woman emerged, grey-haired and regal despite the simple black dress she wore. Behind her came 2 younger servants, both looking crisp and alert despite the early hour. "Mr. Cantrell," the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had seen the world beyond these mountains. Her eyes moved to Cammie, taking in the wool-lined dress, the borrowed shawl, the frozen spray still coating her hem. "And this must be Mrs. Cantrell." Cammie's head spun. Mrs. Cantrell. She wasn't even properly married yet. Linton climbed down and moved around the wagon to offer Cammie his hand. This time she took it, too stunned to maintain her pride. His grip was steady as he helped her down onto stone cobbles that had been swept clean of snow. "Cammie, this is Mrs. Ashford. She manages the household." Linton gestured to the woman. "Mrs. Ashford, my wife. She'll need a bath, warm clothes, and food. And send someone to check on the Gaddis children at the minister's in town. Make sure they have everything they need. My wife." The words hung in the air like something solid. Mrs. Ashford smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes, and gave a small curtsy. A curtsy to Cammie, who still had dirt under her fingernails and patches on her dress. "Of course, sir. Welcome home, Mrs. Cantrell. If you'll follow me." Cammie looked at Linton, who nodded once. She let herself be led inside, through doors that swung on hinges so well oiled they made no sound, into an entrance hall that stole what little breath she had left. Marble floors, polished to mirror brightness. A grand staircase sweeping upward, its banister carved from dark wood and inlaid with gold. Chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with scenes of mountains and forests, each fixture holding dozens of electric lights that filled the space with a warm, steady glow. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes and portraits in heavy gilt frames. And everywhere, tastefully incorporated into the architecture, was more gold. Servants moved through the space with quiet efficiency. A young man took her mother's wet shawl with gentle hands. A maid appeared with a tray bearing a steaming cup of something that smelled like chocolate and spices. Another servant stood ready with thick towels warmed by what must have been a heating system she couldn't begin to comprehend. They all looked at Linton with something beyond respect. It was deference, the kind of deference reserved for royalty. "The blue room has been prepared," Mrs. Ashford said to Linton. "I took the liberty when you sent word you were bringing a guest. Thank you." Linton remained in his buckskins and worn canvas, looking utterly out of place in this temple of wealth. Yet somehow the servants moved around him like he was the center of gravity. "I'll be in the study if she needs me." He turned to leave, and Cammie's voice caught him. "Wait." He stopped, looking back. "What is this place?" she asked. "What are you?" Linton's expression remained unreadable. "It's complicated. Mrs. Ashford will explain what she can. We'll talk more once you've rested." Then he was gone, his boots echoing on the marble as he disappeared down a hallway lined with what looked like museum-quality artifacts. Mrs. Ashford touched Cammie's elbow gently. "Come, dear. There will be time for questions after you're warm and fed." Cammie let herself be led up the grand staircase, through hallways that seemed to go on forever, past rooms whose doors stood open to reveal libraries and parlors, and spaces whose purposes she couldn't even guess. They finally stopped before a door carved with mountain roses. The blue room was larger than her entire cabin had been. A fire roared in a marble fireplace. A bed that could have slept 5 people dominated one wall, piled with quilts and pillows. Beside it, a copper bathtub steamed, already filled with water that smelled of lavender and something else, something expensive and foreign. "I'll leave you to bathe, Mrs. Ashford said. "There are clothes in the wardrobe that should fit well enough until we can have proper ones made. Ring the bell if you need anything. Breakfast will be served whenever you're ready." She departed, closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt final. Cammie stood in the center of the room, still wearing Linton's fur coat over her frozen dress, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 24 hours ago, she had been counting flour in a dying cabin. Now she stood in a room that belonged in a palace, married to a man who apparently owned all of this. She moved to the window and pulled back curtains heavy enough to be structural. Beyond the glass, the valley stretched out in impossible greenness. Gardens bloomed despite the winter. Greenhouses glowed with interior lights. And in the distance, she could see the dark mouth of what had to be a mine entrance, its perimeter marked by security fencing and guard stations. Gold. He had said gold. A secret gold mine vast enough to build this place, to maintain it, to hide it from the world. Behind her, the bathwater steamed, and her dress dripped, melted snow onto floors inlaid with patterns she suspected were actual precious metal. Cammie Gaddis, who had married a lone wolf hunter to save her family from starvation, began to laugh. It was a sound edged with hysteria, exhaustion, and the slow, creeping realization that she had traded one impossible situation for another. She had thought she was saving her siblings by marrying a primitive mountain man. Instead, she had married a king hiding in buckskins, and she had no idea what kingdom she had just become queen of. 3 days later, Cammie stood in the library, a book on territorial mining law open before her, when the commotion started. She had spent the intervening time learning the castle's layout, meeting the household staff, and trying to reconcile the silent hunter who ate breakfast in buckskins with the man who apparently employed 30 people and owned enough land to qualify as its own small territory. Linton had been patient with her questions, answering what he could in his sparse way, but she sensed vast territories of information he was holding back. The servants treated her with careful respect, teaching her which rooms were which, how the heating system worked, where the nearest telegraph office stood in case she needed to send word about her siblings. But every time she asked about the mine, about where exactly the gold came from, about why no one in town seemed to know he owned all this, Linton would deflect. "Later," he would say, "when you're settled." Now, standing in the library with winter sun streaming through windows that probably cost more than her family's entire homestead, she heard horses, many horses, and the sound of wagon wheels on stone. She moved to the window and looked down at the drive. A carriage had arrived, elegant and expensive, pulled by a matched team of bays. Behind it came a wagon loaded with trunks and cases. Men in city clothes climbed down, brushing travel dust from suits that wouldn't last a day in the mountains. And at the front, emerging from the carriage with the bearing of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself for his convenience, stood a man who looked like Linton's opposite. Tall and lean where Linton was broad, clean-shaven where Linton wore a beard, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit with a gold watch chain and polished shoes that had never seen honest work. But the face, the structure of bone and the color of his eyes, they were Linton's, refined into something harder and colder. Cammie's stomach dropped. She didn't need to be told who this was. She found Linton in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door, watching the arrivals below. He had changed into cleaner clothes but still wore buckskins and a simple wool shirt. Next to his brother's finery, he would look like a primitive. "You knew he was coming," Cammie said. Linton didn't turn. "I suspected. Who is he?" "Silas Cantrell. My brother." The words came out flat, emptied of emotion. The legitimate heir to the Cantrell fortune, or so he's always claimed. He lives in Denver most of the year, owns banks and businesses, and keeps company with territorial officials. And he's here because... Now Linton did turn, and his expression was grim. "Because someone told him I got married, and Silas has very particular ideas about who deserves to own what." Before Cammie could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Mrs. Ashford appeared in the doorway, her face carefully neutral. "Mr. Silas Cantrell to see you, sir. He's brought Marshal Vance and several associates. Show them to the formal parlor." Linton straightened, and Cammie saw something shift in him, a gathering of will like storm clouds forming. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." Mrs. Ashford hesitated. "Sir, the Marshal has papers, legal documents regarding property assessment and competency hearings." The room went very still. Cammie felt the temperature drop despite the fire crackling in the hearth. "Of course he does," Linton said quietly. He looked at Cammie. "You should stay here." "Absolutely not." She heard the steel in her own voice, the same tone she had used to keep her siblings alive through the winter. "If this concerns our home, I'm part of it." Something flickered in Linton's eyes, surprise maybe, or approval. He nodded once. "Then stay close and let me do the talking. Silas is dangerous in ways that don't involve fists or bullets." They descended the grand staircase together. Cammie had chosen one of the simpler dresses from the wardrobe, a dark green day dress that fit her surprisingly well. She had pinned her hair back in a style Mrs. Ashford had taught her, hoping she looked like someone who belonged in this gilded world, rather than someone who had been counting flour 4 days ago. The formal parlor was decorated in cream and gold, with furniture that looked too delicate to actually sit on. Silas Cantrell stood before the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel in a pose of calculated casualness. Beside him stood a man in a marshal's uniform, his badge catching the light. 3 other men in suits flanked them, lawyers or businessmen, their expressions professionally neutral. Silas turned as they entered, and his smile was all charm and no warmth. "Linton, brother, it's been too long." His eyes moved to Cammie, assessing her in a single sweeping glance that made her skin crawl. And this must be the new Mrs. Cantrell. How? Rustic. Silas. Linton's voice carried no greeting. "What do you want?" "Straight to business. How like you?" Silas gestured to the Marshal. "This is Marshal Vance, territorial law. He's here regarding some concerns that have been raised about the management of the Cantrell estate." "What concerns?" Marshal Vance stepped forward, pulling documents from his coat. "Mr. Cantrell, the elder Mr. Cantrell, we've received complaints regarding your capacity to properly manage properties of this value. Living in isolation, engaging in primitive pursuits, making sudden legal commitments without proper counsel." His eyes flicked to Cammie. "There are questions about your competency." Cammie felt Linton go rigid beside her. The air in the room changed, became charged with something dangerous. "I see," Linton said softly. "And who filed these complaints?" "Concerned citizens," Silas said smoothly. "People who worry about such vast resources being squandered by someone who prefers hunting to civilization. You understand our position, brother. The territory is growing. Rail lines are coming. Properties like this need proper management, not a hermit who plays at being a savage." "This is my land," Linton said, and now there was steel beneath the quiet. "Legally mine. The deeds are registered and clear." Of course," Silas waved a hand dismissively. "No one's suggesting otherwise. We simply think it would be better served under joint management, a partnership between brothers, with proper oversight. These gentlemen have drawn up papers that would establish a trust, with myself as primary administrator, while you focus on your hobbies." Cammie understood what she was seeing. This was theft, dressed in legal language and delivered with smiles. They meant to take everything Linton had built, everything he was, and wrap it in bureaucracy until he ceased to exist except as a footnote. "No," Linton said simply. Silas's smile thinned. "Be reasonable. Look at yourself. You're dressed like a trapper, living like a mountain man. Do you really think territorial courts will side with you over concerns raised by respected businessmen and law enforcement?" I said no. Marshal Vance cleared his throat. "Mr. Cantrell, I'm authorized to place you under house restriction pending a competency hearing in Denver. You'll remain on the property until the territorial judge can assess the situation. If you refuse to cooperate, I can make this official." The lawyers shifted, hands moving toward inside pockets where Cammie suspected legal documents waited to be served. This was it, she realized. This was the moment where everything Linton had protected, everything he had built in secret, would be taken from him by men in suits who had never spent a day doing honest work. She stepped forward before she could think better of it. "Gentlemen," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice came. "I wonder if you've considered all the implications of your accusations." Every eye in the room turned to her. Silas's smile became patronizing. "Mrs. Cantrell, these are complex legal matters. My husband," she cut him off, "makes regular surveying trips throughout the territory, mapping terrain, documenting resources, establishing routes for what everyone knows is coming, the railroad expansion. He's been doing this for years while you've been sitting in Denver counting money you didn't earn." Silence fell. She saw Linton's eyes widen slightly, but she pressed on. "So when you call him incompetent, when you suggest he's wasting resources playing at being a savage, what you're really saying is that the territorial government should ignore the man who knows these mountains better than anyone alive. The man who's already mapped the routes that will determine where the rails go." She let that sink in, watching the marshal's expression shift. "I imagine the governor would be very interested to know that someone's trying to interfere with his chief surveyor." It was a bluff. A massive, desperate bluff based on fragments of overheard conversation and wild guessing. But she sold it with everything she had, meeting Silas's eyes without flinching. "That's absurd," Silas said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Is it?" Cammie turned to Marshal Vance. "My husband has maps, Marshal. Detailed surveys of the entire Northern Territory. Rail companies have been trying to buy them for years. If you serve those papers, if you place him under restriction, those maps become inaccessible at precisely the moment the governor needs them most." She was making it up as she went, threading together everything she had observed, every book she had read in the library, every scrap of overheard conversation. But she delivered it like established fact, like she had been part of these plans all along. Marshal Vance looked at Silas, then at Linton. "Is this true?" Linton's face remained unreadable, but Cammie saw the slightest tightening around his eyes that might have been surprise or approval, or both. "My wife is well informed about my activities." "Well informed," Silas repeated, his voice sharp. "She's been here less than a week, and yet she grasps what you've never understood, brother." Linton stepped forward, placing himself beside Cammie in a gesture of solidarity. "This estate, everything I've built, it's not about gold or timber or playing mountain man. It's about having leverage when the territory changes. About being indispensable when the railroad companies and government officials start carving up the land." He was running with her bluff, Cammie realized, building on her foundation with details she couldn't have known. "The gold mine alone would make me valuable," Linton continued. "But the surveys, the territory knowledge, the relationships with the mountain communities that makes me essential. So go ahead, Silas. File your papers. Declare me incompetent. And watch what happens when the governor learns someone's trying to sideline his most valuable territorial asset." Marshal Vance's hand had moved away from his pocket. The lawyers exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to their plan. Silas's face had gone cold with fury. "You're bluffing. She's lying to protect you." "Then call the bluff," Cammie said. "Wire the governor. Ask him about his plans for the Northern Rail extension." See if my husband's name comes up." She knew this was the critical moment, where everything would either fall apart or hold together by sheer force of conviction. Or you could leave now, with some dignity intact, before you find out exactly how much power you're actually challenging. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Marshal Vance folded the documents back into his coat. "Mr. Silas Cantrell," he said carefully, "perhaps we should verify a few details before proceeding. If what Mrs. Cantrell says is true, this matter has implications beyond local property management." Silas's jaw worked. His eyes moved between Linton and Cammie, calculating, reassessing. Finally, he gave a smile that was all edges. "Of course, we wouldn't want to interfere with territorial interests." He straightened his cuffs with deliberate precision. "This isn't over, brother. There are other ways to address concerns about competency, other legal avenues to explore." "I'm sure there are," Linton said. "You've always been good at finding ways to take what isn't yours." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Silas gestured to his associates, and they filed out, Marshal Vance giving Linton a curt nod before following. The sound of their departure echoed through the entrance hall, followed by the rumble of carriage wheels on stone. Only when the sound faded completely did Cammie allow herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. Linton turned to her slowly. His expression was unreadable. "Railroad surveys," he said quietly. "Chief surveyor." That was quick thinking. Was I wrong? She held his gaze, refusing to apologize for the gamble. No. Something shifted in his face, the slightest easing of the iron control he maintained. "In fact, you were mostly right. I do survey the territory. I do have maps that rail companies want. I'm just not officially anyone's chief surveyor." His mouth quirked. "Yet, so I accidentally told the truth. You bought us time, and you made Silas uncertain, which is more than I've managed in years." He studied her with those storm-grey eyes. "Where did you learn to bluff like that?" Cammie thought of winter nights, arguing prices at the trading post, of facing down creditors who wanted to take what little her family had left, of standing between her siblings and starvation, with nothing but determination, and whatever lies would keep them alive one more day. "I learned from survival," she said. "Same as you." Linton nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something that might have been respect in his expression. "Mrs. Cantrell," he said formally, "I think we need to have a very long conversation about exactly what you've gotten yourself into." "I think you're right, Mr. Cantrell." She straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the green dress, the impossible warmth of the castle, the complexity of the life she had traded her freedom for. "And then you're going to tell me everything. The gold, the surveys, why your brother hates you enough to steal your empire, and what exactly I'm supposed to do as queen of this gilded cage." Outside, snow had begun to fall again. But here in the golden castle, surrounded by warmth and wealth and secrets she had barely begun to uncover, Cammie Gaddis felt something shift inside her. She had come here to survive. But survival, she was beginning to understand, was just the first step. The real question was what came after, and whether she had the strength to claim it. The morning after Silas's departure, Linton found Cammie in the library, surrounded by territorial maps and mining regulations. She had barely slept, her mind churning through everything she had learned, and everything she still needed to understand. "Come with me," he said simply. She followed him through the castle, past the servants' quarters and the kitchen gardens, down a path that wound through the geothermal valley. The air grew warmer as they walked, thick with mineral scent. Steam rose from pools of crystalline water that never froze. They reached what looked like an ordinary maintenance shed built into the hillside. Linton produced a key not from his pocket, but from beneath a false stone in the wall. The door swung open to reveal not a shed but a tunnel, its walls reinforced with timber and iron. Lanterns hung at intervals, their glass spotless. "How far down?" Cammie asked. "Far enough." He lit one of the lanterns and handed it to her, taking another for himself. "Watch your step." The tunnel descended at a gentle angle, wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The air remained warm, almost comfortable despite the depth. After what felt like a quarter-mile, the tunnel opened into a cavern that stole Cammie's breath. Gold. Not veins or seams, but an entire wall of it, stretching upward into darkness beyond the reach of lantern light. It ran through the rock like frozen lightning, thick as tree trunks in places, branching and rejoining in patterns that looked almost organic. The lantern light caught it and multiplied, filling the cavern with a glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Sweet God," Cammie whispered. "My grandfather found it in 1847, Linton said, his voice echoing strangely in the space. He was hunting elk and fell through a sinkhole into this cavern. Took him 3 days to find his way out. When he did, he told no one. Not his brother, not his business partners, only my father, when he was dying." He moved closer to the gold wall, running his hand along it with something like reverence. "My father spent 40 years quietly extracting just enough to build an empire while keeping the source hidden. When he died, it came to me and Silas equally. The timber operations, the Denver properties, everything on the surface was supposed to be shared. But not this," Cammie said, understanding dawning. "Not this. Father knew Silas would tear it all down, would mine it until nothing remained, and damn the consequences. A gold strike this large would destabilize the territorial economy, maybe the whole region. Men would kill for it. Governments would seize it." Linton's jaw tightened. "So he left it to me alone, with instructions to protect it at any cost. Silas got the legitimate empire. I got the secret that made it all possible." Cammie moved closer, her fingers hovering over the gold without quite touching it. "And Silas knows? He suspects. He's always suspected, but he's never found proof, never located the actual mine." Linton turned to face her. "That's why he wants me declared incompetent. If he controls the estate, he controls access to the valley. Eventually, he'd find this, and then he'd sell it. To rail companies, mining corporations, whoever offered the most. The valley would be destroyed within a decade, and he'd be rich enough to buy a Senate seat." His voice was flat, but Cammie heard the pain beneath it. Everything my father built, everything he protected, would be gone. She studied him in the golden light. This man who dressed like a primitive, but guarded an empire. "You could have told me this before I married you. Would you have believed me?" Fair point. If he had mentioned a secret gold mine before she had seen the castle, she would have thought him mad. "What happens now?" she asked. "Silas won't give up. He'll come back with different papers, different threats. I know." Linton extinguished his lantern, preparing to return to the surface. "Which is why you need to learn to fight him on his own ground." The training began the next morning. Mrs. Ashford proved to be more than a housekeeper. She had been raised in Philadelphia society before coming west with her late husband. She understood the rules of the world Cammie would need to navigate. "Posture first," Mrs. Ashford said, circling Cammie in the formal parlor. "You carry yourself like you're ready to haul water or chop wood. That's admirable for survival, but it reads as servile to people like Silas's associates." Cammie straightened, pulling her shoulders back. "Better. Now imagine you own everything in this room, not because someone gave it to you, but because you built it with your own hands." Mrs. Ashford's voice was patient but firm. "That's the bearing you need. Confidence without aggression." They practiced walking, sitting, managing the complicated dresses that the wealthy wore like armor. Cammie learned which fork to use for which course, how to hold a wine glass, how to make small talk that said nothing while gathering information. She learned to smile with her mouth while keeping her eyes calculating, to deflect questions without seeming evasive. But Mrs. Ashford also understood who Cammie was beneath the training. "Don't lose your edge," she said one afternoon as they reviewed territorial politics. "These people respect strength, even if it makes them uncomfortable. You saved Linton with quick thinking and boldness. That's what you bring to this battle, not perfect etiquette, but the willingness to do what needs doing." Linton joined them in the evenings, teaching her about the business side of the empire, the timber contracts, the mining claims held under various names, the network of informants who kept him aware of territorial politics. He showed her the maps he had made, detailed surveys of the entire northern range that were indeed valuable enough to interest the railroad companies. "You weren't entirely bluffing," Cammie said, studying a map that showed mineral deposits and potential rail routes. "No, but I wasn't officially working for anyone either. You turned my private work into a government position in about 30 seconds. Something almost like amusement touched his voice. "The governor doesn't know I exist. Yet. So we make it true," Cammie said, the plan forming as she spoke. "We offer the surveys to the territorial government. Make you indispensable. Give them a reason to protect you from Silas." Linton studied her for a long moment. "You understand what that means. Once we're entangled with territorial politics, we lose some of our isolation. The castle stops being a secret." "The castle stopped being a secret the moment I married you," Cammie countered. "Silas proved that. We can't hide forever. We can only make ourselves too valuable to attack." 2 weeks into her training, Marshal Vance returned. This time he came alone, arriving just after dawn. Cammie and Linton met him in the entrance hall, both dressed for the day, Linton in his customary buckskins, Cammie in a simple morning dress that Mrs. Ashford had deemed appropriate for receiving unexpected guests. "Mr. Cantrell, Mrs. Cantrell." Vance removed his hat but didn't offer a smile. "I apologize for the early hour, but I'm here in an official capacity." "Again?" Cammie kept her voice neutral. "New complaints have been filed, anonymous this time, but detailed. They allege irregular business practices, possible fraud in mining claims, and concerns about security of territorial resources." He pulled papers from his coat. "I'm authorized to conduct an investigation. You and your husband are restricted to the property until it's complete. I'll need access to your business records, maps, and financial documents." Cammie felt Linton go still beside her. This was worse than the first attempt. House arrest gave Silas's people time to search the estate, to potentially find the mine. "How long?" Linton asked. "As long as it takes. Could be days, could be weeks." Vance's expression remained professionally neutral. "I'll try to be thorough, but quick. I have men outside to ensure the terms of the restriction are observed." Through the windows, Cammie could see riders taking up positions around the estate. 6 of them, all armed, all wearing territorial badges. They weren't just investigating, they were occupying. "I see," Linton said quietly. "You'll want to start in the study. Mrs. Ashford will show you." After Vance departed to begin his search, Cammie grabbed Linton's arm. "He's going to find the mine entrance. Not if we're careful. The tunnel entrance looks like a maintenance shed. Nothing remarkable." But worry creased his face. "The problem is the documents. My father kept meticulous records. If Vance is thorough, then we don't give him time to be thorough." Cammie's mind was already racing. "When does the governor visit the territory?" Linton blinked at the sudden shift. "He's scheduled to be in the territorial capital next month for the annual assembly. Then we move that up. We offer him the maps now, in exchange for protection. Make the deal before Silas can undermine us. We're under house arrest. We can't travel to the capital." "No," Cammie agreed, "but the governor could come here, especially if we make it worth his while." She was pacing now, the way she used to when solving problems in the cabin. "We host an event, something formal and public. A reception showcasing the estate and the resources we're offering to the territory. Invite the governor, key legislators, business leaders. Make it impossible for Silas to move against us without everyone watching." Linton stared at her. "A masquerade," he said slowly. "My father used to host them. Political gatherings disguised as social events. But that was before I." He gestured to himself, to the buckskins and beard, the man he had become in isolation. "Then it's time to become someone else," Cammie said. "Just for one night. We play their game better than they do. We make them see you not as a primitive they can dismiss, but as a power they need." She met his eyes. "Can you do that?" For a moment, she thought he would refuse, would retreat into the solitude he had built around himself. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. For the estate. For the mine. For... He paused. For you. Yes. The preparations consumed the next 3 weeks. Invitations went out on thick paper edged in gold, announcing a gold and ice ball at the Cantrell estate. The theme was carefully chosen, sophisticated enough to attract the elite, mysterious enough to build anticipation. Cammie worked with Mrs. Ashford to plan every detail, from the menu to the music to the strategic placement of conversation areas where deals could be made. Marshal Vance's investigation continued, but they carefully managed what he saw. Linton provided enough business records to appear cooperative, while misdirecting attention from anything that might reveal the mine's location. The Marshal seemed increasingly frustrated by the complexity of the Cantrell empire, the layers of holdings and partnerships that would take months to fully untangle. "He's stalling," Vance told Cammie one afternoon. "Your husband has interests in 17 different companies, claims on 43 mining sites, and contracts with 3 territorial governments. I can't assess all this without a full accounting team." "Then, perhaps," Cammie suggested carefully, "you should wait until after the governor's visit. He'll want to discuss economic development with my husband. It would be awkward if Mr. Cantrell were under formal investigation during negotiations." Vance's eyes narrowed. "That sounds like political pressure." "That sounds like practical timing," Cammie corrected. "Unless you want to explain to the governor why you delayed conversations that could bring rail service to the Northern Territory." The night of the ball arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Carriages began arriving at dusk, following a specially cleared road that Linton's men had prepared. The estate blazed with light, every window glowing, the gardens lit by lanterns that turned the snow into fields of diamonds. Cammie stood in the blue room, staring at herself in a full-length mirror that showed a stranger. The dress was gold silk that caught the light and threw it back transformed, fitted at the bodice and flowing to the floor in layers that suggested wealth without ostentation. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style by Mrs. Ashford, with small gold ornaments woven through it. Gloves covered her calloused hands. She wore her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath the dress, the only piece of her old life visible. "You look like a queen," Mrs. Ashford said softly. "I look like I'm pretending to be something I'm not," Cammie replied. "No, you look like you're becoming something you already were." Mrs. Ashford adjusted the dress's shoulders. "You were born to survive, Cammie. That means adapting. Tonight, you adapt to this battlefield. Tomorrow, you can go back to being whoever you need to be." A knock at the door. Linton entered, and Cammie's breath caught. He had shaved the heavy beard, leaving only a neat mustache. His hair was trimmed and styled back from his face. He wore a black suit tailored so perfectly it must have been made for him years ago, with a grey silk vest and a tie pin that held a small gold nugget. He looked elegant, dangerous, and utterly unfamiliar. "I feel ridiculous," he said quietly. "You look like someone Silas can't dismiss as a mountain savage," Cammie replied. She crossed to him and adjusted his tie pin, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "You look like the man who built an empire." His grey eyes met hers. "Together," he said. "We face them together." The ballroom was a space Cammie had barely seen during her training, kept closed while preparations were underway. Now, it took her breath away. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, painted with scenes of mountain grandeur. Chandeliers hung like frozen starbursts, their electric lights steady and bright. The floors were polished marble, inlaid with gold in patterns that suggested natural veining. At one end, a small orchestra played, their music floating through air scented with pine and winter roses. Guests filled the space in evening finery, their masks ranging from simple black silk to elaborate creations of feathers and jewels. The effect was surreal, familiar faces made strange, identities hidden while power dynamics remained visible to those who knew how to look. Silas stood near the fireplace, resplendent in black and silver, his mask a sleek affair that emphasized rather than hid his aristocratic features. Marshal Vance was there too, without a mask but in his best uniform, looking uncomfortable among the wealth. And there, surrounded by territorial officials, stood a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes. Governor William Bradford. Linton took Cammie's arm, and they descended the grand staircase together. Conversation paused. Heads turned. She felt the weight of judgment, of assessment, of 100 calculations being made about who they were and what they represented. "Mr. and Mrs. Cantrell," the announcer's voice carried across the ballroom. "Your hosts for the evening." Applause rippled through the crowd, polite and measured. They reached the ballroom floor, and immediately people began to approach officials wanting to discuss business, society matrons curious about the mysterious estate, businessmen hoping to forge connections. Cammie moved through it all with the poise Mrs. Ashford had taught her, making small talk while listening for useful information, smiling while assessing who might be friend or foe. She was acutely aware of Silas watching from across the room, his expression unreadable behind the mask. Governor Bradford approached as the first course was being served. He was a shrewd man in his 60s, his mask token rather than concealing, his eyes missing nothing. "Mr. Cantrell," he said, offering his hand. "Your estate is impressive. I had no idea such a place existed in the Northern Territory." "Governor." Linton's grip was firm. "Thank you for accepting the invitation. I hope we can discuss opportunities for territorial development." "Indeed. I understand you have surveys that might interest the Rail Commission." Before Linton could respond, Silas appeared, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. "Governor Bradford, how wonderful to see you. I trust my brother has been a gracious host." His smile was all charm. "Though I worry he may be overstating his resources. Linton has always had a flair for the dramatic." "Dramatic?" The governor's eyebrow raised. "This estate seems quite real." "Oh, the estate is real enough. Built on family money, of course, though Linton prefers to take sole credit." Silas sipped his wine. "But these surveys he's mentioned, I'd be careful about making commitments based on my brother's claims. His judgment has been questionable lately." Cammie felt Linton tense beside her. This was it, the moment Silas would try to undermine everything they had built toward. "Questionable how?" Bradford asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Well, there's the matter of his sudden marriage to a woman of no background." Silas's eyes flicked to Cammie with false sympathy. "No offense intended, Mrs. Cantrell, but one wonders about decision-making when a man chooses a wife from desperation rather than sense. And then there are the business irregularities that Marshal Vance has been investigating." "Actually," Marshal Vance's voice cut through the conversation. He had approached quietly, his expression troubled. "I need to speak with you, Silas. Privately." Silas's mask of charm slipped for just a moment. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time." Vance pulled papers from his coat. "During my investigation, I found some interesting discrepancies in the Cantrell family finances. Specifically, in the Denver properties that you manage." The ballroom had gone quiet, conversations dying as people sensed drama unfolding. "I don't know what you're implying," Silas said, his voice ice. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Vance glanced at Governor Bradford. "For the past 5 years, Silas Cantrell has been systematically embezzling from the family timber operations. Nearly $40,000 redirected through shell companies and false contracts. The evidence is extensive." Cammie's heart hammered. This wasn't part of the plan, or was it? She glanced at Linton and saw controlled satisfaction in his eyes. He had known. Somehow, he had known and had positioned Vance to discover it. "That's ridiculous," Silas sputtered. "Those are legitimate business expenses, including payments to the men you sent to harass the Gaddis family," Vance continued relentlessly. "The creditors who pushed them to the edge of starvation. I have testimony that you orchestrated their troubles, hoping to force Linton into a desperate marriage with someone you could manipulate." His eyes moved to Cammie. "But Mrs. Cantrell proved less manipulable than you expected." The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Society matrons whispered behind fans. Businessmen exchanged meaningful glances. Governor Bradford's expression had gone cold. Silas's face flushed red. "You can't prove." "I can and did." Vance gestured to two territorial deputies who had been standing near the door. "Silas Cantrell, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. You'll be held for trial in the territorial capital." As the deputies moved forward, Silas's eyes found Linton. Pure hatred blazed there. All pretense of brotherly concern burned away. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won? You're still just a savage playing dress-up. And you're still just a thief playing gentleman," Linton replied quietly. "The difference is, I never pretended to be something I wasn't." They led Silas away, his protests fading as he was escorted from the ballroom. The orchestra, after a moment of uncertainty, began playing again. Conversation resumed, but the tone had shifted. People looked at Linton and Cammie with new respect, new wariness. Governor Bradford cleared his throat. Well, that was illuminating. He studied Linton with sharp eyes. "About those surveys, Mr. Cantrell, I think we should discuss terms. The territory needs men of vision and integrity. You seem to be both." They talked long into the night, negotiations flowing around dinner courses and dancing. Bradford was interested in more than surveys. He wanted to establish an official territorial surveyor position, with Linton in charge of mapping the entire northern range. In exchange, the Cantrell estate would receive legal protections and government support for selective mining operations. Selective, Bradford emphasized. Not wholesale extraction. We're trying to build a civilization here, not strip the land bare. Agreed, Linton said. Sustainable development. The land protected, but not hoarded. Cammie listened to them negotiate, marveling at how Linton had transformed from silent hunter to sophisticated businessman without losing the core of who he was. She excused herself eventually, needing air, and found her way to a balcony overlooking the valley. The night was clear and cold, stars thick overhead. Below, the geothermal pools steamed in the moonlight. She could see the gardens, the orchards, the hidden mouth of the mine that held enough gold to change the territory forever. Footsteps behind her. Linton joined her at the railing, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened. He looked more like himself this way, elegant but slightly undone. "You knew about the embezzlement," Cammie said. "I suspected. My father kept duplicate records that Silas didn't know about. When Vance started his investigation, I made sure he found them. You used the investigation against him. I used his own trap to catch him." Linton leaned against the railing. He thought he could pressure me through legal threats. Instead, he gave me the perfect opportunity to expose his crimes in front of the people whose respect he craved most. Cammie smiled despite herself. "That's cold. I learned from the best." He looked at her. "You saved this tonight. The ball, the negotiations, all of it. This was your strategy. I just followed your father's model. Disguise business as socializing. No, you did more than that. You took a mountain savage and made him valuable to the territory. You turned isolation into leverage." He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm through the glove. "You saved me, Cammie. Not just the estate. Me." She looked at their joined hands, thought of everything that had brought them here. The frozen cabin, the desperate marriage, the crossing of the ice, the revelations and training and battles fought with words instead of bullets. "You saved me first," she said quietly. "When you showed up with that deer and a proposal, you gave my family a future. Speaking of which," Linton reached into his coat and produced a telegram. "This arrived this afternoon. Your siblings are well. They're ready to travel when you send for them." Cammie's throat tightened. She had been so focused on survival, on battles with Silas, that she had almost let herself forget why she had agreed to all this. "I want them here," she said. "I want them to see this, to know they're safe. Then we'll bring them home. Home." The word settled over her like a blanket, not the cabin where she had counted flour and watched her family starve, not the valley where her father had frozen trying to find help. This place, This impossible golden castle hidden in the mountains, where a lone wolf had built a kingdom and then shared it with a girl who knew how to survive. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. The snow retreated to the highest peaks. The valley bloomed with flowers that had no business existing at this elevation, fed by geothermal heat and careful cultivation. The orchards produced fruit, the gardens flourished, and the castle seemed to settle into itself with satisfied permanence. Cammie stood at the entrance as a wagon came up the drive, her heart in her throat, when her siblings climbed down, looking stunned and overwhelmed and impossibly older than when she had last seen them. She ran to meet them. They collided in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. Her sister was taller now, her brother's voice deeper. They smelled of town soap and wore clothes that the minister's wife had bought them, but underneath they were still her family, still the reason she had made every impossible choice. "Is this really yours?" her brother asked, staring up at the castle with wide eyes. "Ours," Cammie corrected. "This is home now, for all of us." She showed them everything, the rooms they would have, the library full of books, the gardens where they could play without worrying about wolves or weather. She showed them the kitchens where food was always plentiful, the heating system that meant they would never be cold again, the stables full of horses they could learn to ride. Linton watched from a distance, giving them space for reunion. But later, when the children were settled and exploring with Mrs. Ashford as guide, he found Cammie in the library. "They're wonderful," he said simply. "They're survivors." Cammie smiled. "Like us." He moved to stand beside her, and she noticed he had changed back into buckskins and a simple shirt. The suit was gone, the gentleman's mask removed. He looked more comfortable this way, more himself. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what comes next. The territory wants me to start the official surveys next month. It means traveling, being away from the estate for weeks at a time." Cammie felt a flicker of fear. "You're leaving? I'm asking if you want to come." He turned to face her fully. "This empire, this castle, it was my father's dream, then mine. But it's lonely without someone to share it with. These past months, having you here, working together." He paused, choosing words carefully. "You make it mean something beyond just survival." She studied him, this man who had saved her family, and then let her save him in return. He was still a mystery in many ways, still carried silences she hadn't fully learned to read, but she understood the core of him now, the fierce protectiveness, the strategic mind, the loneliness that had driven him into isolation until desperation forced him to reach out. "I'm not leaving my siblings again," she said firmly. "They come too. All of us. We make this work as a family." He smiled, a rare, full expression that transformed his face. "I married you to save you, but somewhere along the way, you saved me back. I'd like to see what we can build together when we're not just surviving but living." Cammie reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that had pulled her from drowning ice and political quicksand. "Together," she agreed. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Through the window, she could see her siblings racing through the gardens, their laughter carrying on the spring air. The valley stretched green and impossible around them, guarded by mountains that had kept this secret for generations. The golden castle stood solid and warm, no longer a gilded cage but a sanctuary they had fought to protect. She had come here expecting primitive survival. Instead, she had found an empire, fought a war, and claimed a kingdom. She had married a lone wolf and discovered he was a king, and in the process, she had become a queen not through blood or tradition, but through the same fierce will that had kept her family alive through the worst winter of their lives. Outside, the future waited surveys to complete, a territory to help build, a life to create from the ashes of everything they had lost. But here, in this moment, Cammie Gaddis Cantrell allowed herself to simply be, to feel the warmth of home, the safety of family, the strange and unexpected joy of a partnership forged in desperation and tempered into something that might, against all odds, become love. The lone wolf had found his pack, and the mountain girl who married him had found that survival was only the beginning. Everything else, the power, the purpose, the golden reign that would follow was theirs to create together.